Hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters and journalists around the world. My name's Owen Bennett-Jones, sitting in for Nicholas Wood today, and we're discussing Germany and the recent elections there, state-level elections with very strong results for the far-right AfD. And we're going to discuss them with a senior journalist from Germany, Michaela Kuefner, who is chief political editor of Deutsche Welle. You can see her on the screen now. I'm told it's recorded, but it looks very splendid. And she says it's a lovely day there. Anyway, so it could be live. And Michaela, let's just start with these elections that have happened in the last few weeks. There was a win for the AfD. It was a big result for them. Tell us where it was, what happened.
Yes, it was a huge result in two small eastern states. The far-right Alternative for Germany party, which is anti-migration, actually won its first regional elections in the state of Thuringia. And a neighboring Saxony came second to the Conservatives, Angela Merkel's CDU party. And this is the first time that a far-right party actually won a very important election, because it is a whole state election since, well, really in modern times, since the Second World War. And that's why it sent such shockwaves through the political system here in Germany. And it also really gave them more political clout in driving the political agenda here in Germany. Having said that, these are two small states. There the AfD scored above 30% in both cases. Nationwide, it's more around about, depending on which poll you believe, 15, 16, 17%.
Okay, and 10 years ago, well, let's say 5 years ago, where would it have been?
Oh, well, 5 years ago, it would have been clearly in the low single digits. Really, the party was almost on the way out. It's a party that was founded on Euroscepticism, which probably resonates with particularly Brits who are listening to this. Anti-Euro, anti-European Union. There was talk of Dexit very early on, and then it really petered out. It was on the way into political oblivion, and then came 2015, a moment that became known as the migration crisis here in Europe. And then that's where Angela Merkel's so-called open arms policy of not closing the border to around 1 million migrants who became mostly refugees here in Germany from Syria saw the Alternative for Germany rise again, and they really have not, they've only gained traction ever since, because they continue their anti-migration stance.
Now, I find this term far right quite difficult, because I'm never clear who it applies to. You know, we've got, Nigel Farage in the UK, you've got Le Pen in France, you've got AfD, and there are various iterations of this sort of politics through Europe, with slightly different positions on pretty important issues, and importantly different positions. Are you comfortable? I mean, is it normal discourse in Germany to call them far right?
Well, it actually comes down to how it really is a consensus now. And I'll tell you why, because there's a very specific reason. The leader of the Alternative for Germany in that very state of Thuringia, where they just won the elections, he can actually be legally called a fascist. He lost a battle in court to have someone stop calling him that because of his xenophobic comments in the past, because he also just lost in court for using former SS parole. He's a former history teacher, and that is proven in a court of law that he can be called a fascist. Now, the far-right Alternative for Germany party is not homogeneous throughout Germany. It has been in constant flux ever since it was founded just over a decade ago. And every time it had to take a decision of which way to go politically, every time there was a leadership contest, a leadership showdown, it chose to go with a leader who took them further to the right, further into the extreme. Their youth organization is being very closely monitored by Germany's domestic intelligence because there's so much fascist, far-right symbolism and rhetoric coming from there. So that's why, certainly in the German historical context, there is consensus that amongst, well, I'll say media who are aware of, what this means in terms of a label, that they are far-right, ask the Alternative for Germany, and they feel like there's almost a witch hunt against them, that everybody is set against them. They don't trust the media. They will accuse us, who we try to show many different perspectives to create balance. They accuse us of basically being out to get them. That's where the political discourse here is in Germany. And I think that resonates with other places around the world as well, and also across the Atlantic.
Sure, but it's very interesting to hear that there is official sanction, or legal sanction anyway, for calling them fascists. Now, I mean, that raises so many questions in Germany, the country that probably did the most of any country to atone for what happened in the Second World War, to face up to it, to think about it, to discuss it, to teach it, to deal with it. And, others didn't. And yet, it seems all that work that went in after the Second World War to try and understand what had happened in Germany, maybe there's a section of the population, you're saying, quite a significant section that haven't really taken on board what happened. Do you think that's fair?
Well, I guess that is a generational task, and you say Germany did a lot to really reflect, but it didn't voluntarily either. Okay, that was under the auspices of the Americans. Many trials didn't take place till in the 60s. There's prominent figures who really risked a lot within German society to push that forward. So it was kind of pressed upon German society. And the far-right Alternative for Germany, they are very careful not to see themselves framed as any kind of neo-Nazis, though a former leader of them, Alexander Gauland, he's a co-founder, he called the Nazi period and I quote, Fliegenschiss, just to kind of, it literally means a bird dropping, just a speck of bird dropping in German history. And he was trying to belittle Germany's civilization breach through the Holocaust. Now, without becoming that history heavy, I would like to kind of zoom out a bit out of the German specific setting, because there's another counter argument. You could also argue that Germany is kind of a bit delayed in what has become a European right-wing rise, both in France, also in Italy, and to actually also look at Hungary. You have, right-wing parties really getting a lot more traction. And the big question here, how much of this is connected to the specific history of Germany, and how much is this a reflection of the times we live in, where democracies are in decline, unfortunately, or the number of democracies is going back. The certainty of the post-Cold War period that every country in the world will eventually become a democracy, that seems to have evaporated. And it seems to be a lot more mainstream to be towards the political right again. So this seems to be something that is a societal phenomenon and almost kind of an expression of the times we live in. And I think it takes a lot of forensic, deep diving into a society to find out how much is due to history and how much is due to the current context we live in. Because one thing is also for sure, that a more authoritarian style of leadership is no longer something people find should be a taboo. That seems to be becoming more attractive as well.
That's a really good point, that it's happening everywhere. So why single out Germany for its history in this? And yes, I take the point. But if you look at the broad spectrum of European politics, maybe I could put it like this. Where would the AfD have its closest allies who say, yes, we want to be friends with you, we want to work with you, we share your sort of platform? Because I know Marine Le Pen has not done that, has she? She said she doesn't want a relationship with the AfD. Are there any...
Anymore.
Right. Are there any parties that do openly cooperate with them?
No. There's something called the firewall here in Germany. No party of the center, and you're seeing the semantics change here, really is willing to work with the far-right AfD. Nobody was ever really willing to do that. There's a new phenomenon, a political phenomenon that has risen out of nowhere in these regional elections that suddenly became so important because the AfD was about to make history at the regional level there, which is the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. Sarah Wagenknecht is a woman who was a leading figure in the left party. And, just to put it in very blunt words, she went so far to the left that she came out on the right again, almost, certainly in terms of migration policy. And she is merging. She's presenting a mix of policies to the left in terms of social spending, together with an anti-migration stance, and that really became very attractive to voters. She went straight up to the high single and small double digits in those regional elections. And she now is a political force to reckon with as well. So what we're seeing is a further fragmentation here, and particularly in eastern states, a sense of disappointment with the political center. And I think that's really where the big crisis here lies. It's the end of the big tent parties across Europe, and it looks like having a coalition, and coalition governments are pretty much the norm here in Germany. That is becoming increasingly context as the political sphere becomes more fragmented.
That's interesting to get that, and the firewall is obviously very important in the context of German domestic politics. What I was wondering was whether any parties in Europe are cooperating.
Oh, yes.
Here. Where do they stand in relation to all those far-right parties?
Well, they're pretty isolated in Europe as well. They're now talking about having their own parliamentary group in the European Parliament. This all after Marine Le Pen basically decided no longer to want to have anything to do with the far-right Alternative for Germany. She said they lacked leadership. And this, again, can be explained more through the prism of looking at French domestic politics, because after these elections that Emmanuel Macron called after the European elections, Marine Le Pen is now firmly, due to her increase in votes that she achieved there, she is very much set on the big prize of the next presidential elections. And she clearly was keen to put some distance between herself and those who are drifting ever further to the right with no end in sight how far they are willing to go. I mean, we did have a scandal here in Germany where a key advisor of Alice Weidel, the co-leader of the far-right AfD party, was at a gathering where there was talk of having mass deportations, not just of people who are illegally in Germany, but of people who have any kind of foreign roots, so they're Germans. Okay, so it was an attempt to create different categories of Germans, and that really sent shockwaves through not just the political system, but people actually took to the streets against them. And clearly, this was all getting a bit too hot for Marine Le Pen, who's worked for years to put distance between herself and her father, who's openly anti-Semitic and anti-foreigners in whatever kind of context.
Now, let me just say, if anyone listening would like to ask a question, please just raise your hand, leave a comment in the chat box. I'll get you involved in the conversation. So do feel free to just indicate that you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, and we'll take that from you. Can I just ask you about the AfD's support base? Who is backing it? Is it youth? Is it elderly? Is it what's the socioeconomic breakdown? Regional? Where's it coming from?
Well, okay, I can't give you the full regional stats, but the big shocking factor, both in the European elections, but also in the regional elections, is first of all that polling has shown that it's not just a protest vote against the big tent parties of the center. And this is something that these parties, both the Social Democrats of current Chancellor Olaf Scholz, but also the party of the man who wants to become Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, from the Christian Democrat CDU, that's formerly known as Angela Merkel's party, still is, are really taking to heart that it's not a protest reaction by voters. So they need to take the anti-migration stance very seriously, and the recent attacks that we've seen here have propelled that into a bidding contest on who can be toughest on migration. And the other big thing is that a lot of young people voted for the far-right AfD. In fact, in those regional elections we just spoke about, generally you can almost say the older people were, the less likely they were to vote for the far-right AfD party. And that is something that is very disconcerting for the other parties who, after all, we're facing general elections here next year in September.
That is so interesting. I don't know how many young people there are in your life, but when you talk to young Germans, what are you hearing? What are you sensing of why they're doing that?
Well, it's very much also a regional question. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the AfD is in its 30s and in its lower teens in terms of percentage points in the 30s in the East. There seems to be a resentment and a distrust of government and of parties that stand for, as it's being framed, kind of old establishment. So if you go to Eastern states, there is no expectation that anything good will come from the so-called established parties. There is an ingrained anti-migration stance. There are entire communities that are openly far-right. We've seen teachers resign because they were threatened in schools because they called out their own school for having neo-Nazi incidents. So that's a very different climate. And if you talk to young people, both on the left and the right end of the spectrum, they kind of don't trust those parties that have been in government for a very long time to really make a change. Yeah, even I'll just put it as generally as that. So it's more a distrust in long-established political parties. And that is something the AfD is benefiting from, and that is something also the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, which is kind of left and right at the same time, is benefiting from. And the big soul-searching that's currently underway here amongst the Social Democrats and the Christian CDU is how can we reach these people again? And the CDU, the Conservative Party, has actually benefited greatly from shifting further to the right again, which is steering clear of the kind of extreme right, but they were very keen, and particularly the leader, Friedrich Merz, who was a political adversary of Angela Merkel. So he basically left politics for years after he won a power contest. He lost the power contest against Angela Merkel, so he was kind of gone for a decade, has now come back. And he's reverted a lot of Angela Merkel policies and to be more conservative again. He's at pains to prove that to voters, and that seems to be working to a certain degree. And what will be very interesting is how that will play out in the current context of a lot of soul-searching, questioning here what migration is doing to this society and how much of a risk factor is in terms of security. I mean, after this knife attack in Solingen, which came 1 week ahead of those regional elections, parties have been in a constant bidding contest on who can be toughest on migration. We're seeing the knock-on effects in Europe right now. Germany has introduced more border checks, but the question that politicians currently refuse to treat as separate is how people get radicalized and how this individual who should not have been in Germany, that's where the whole migration debate came from, someone who originally came from Afghanistan first and then Syria, could still be in the country and conduct crimes. And so the government is trying to demonstrate that it can act, and it has also conducted the first flight sending back criminal migrants from Afghanistan directly to Afghanistan, despite not having diplomatic relations. And the reason I'm citing all of that is the polling shows upwards of 2/3 of Germans want a more restrictive migration policy. So that is a fact now here in Germany, and that is what all parties are trying to deal with right now.
And just following up on that, can you just give us the detail of what's happened on immigration in the last week or two, the new restrictions that have been brought in? And would you go as far as saying that Schengen, free movement in the heartland European countries, is now significantly challenged? I mean, that it's looking unsustainable, or do you not think that?
Factually, I don't think that. It is at stake at the moment, that is true, but Schengen is working for now. And what we saw, I have to go a bit further back, since that attack leading up to the 1st of September elections, since that attack, which really sent everyone here in a frenzy to prove that they can get migration under control, despite the fact that, you know, there's 1 million Syrians here, hundreds of thousands of Afghans, and by far the most, I mean, you know, tiny fraction actually conducts any kind of criminal offenses. And yes, there were these terrorist attacks now. Okay, so really what this has done to the political debate is that it's made the judgment on whether parties are able to act or the government is able to act, has made it a one-issue question. And that's what everybody's trying to get to terms with. But and that's why Olaf Scholz said he will continue border checks for as long as possible. Germany has to apply for those with the EU, basically notify, and then it gets, you know, accepted. It's always been accepted so far. But these are temporary. They are not stationary checks. They are mobile checks, and they are not. They are only on roads. So it's not like you can. It's not sealing off a country. There's nothing like this border fence, for instance, that Hungary has been building. But what we have seen is. We've seen a summit here where they've decided to cut down on assistance that asylum seekers get once they've been rejected, measures to fast-track deportations, and but also we've seen a lot of hot air in terms of talk. We've seen the leader of the opposition, Friedrich Merz from the Conservatives, basically ask for people to be sent back who don't really have a chance of an asylum claim. That currently violates German and European law. And here the government has said it will adhere to European law. At the same time, if you have border checks, even spot checks, yes, I mean, sometimes it takes longer to cross the border from Austria into Germany, where these checks have been for a very long time already. And they're now being introduced, have been this week, on all German borders. But the other question, of course, is how long is this sustainable? Because this is basically a large-scale police exercise, or how long will it stay in place? I think the really interesting knock-on effect is now the Netherlands saying they want to declare an asylum emergency. This is also something the opposition here had called for. And we're seeing Hungary wanting to leave German asylum policy, which would require an EU treaty change, which basically is not on the card. So all of this is kind of needles and pins into European cohesion and Europe and kind of joint action and having a joint understanding of European law. And I think this is where the damage is already being done. And I can tell you that we're now also hearing individual politicians to question the very right to asylum, which is enshrined in the German constitution for historic reasons again, because many people who were fleeing the Nazis had nowhere to turn to. That's why it became enshrined in the German constitution. Well, that is now being questioned openly again. And if this becomes an election issue next year, I would predict this being something that might be implicitly on the ticket. And that's really where it gets to the nuts and bolts of what Germany wants to stand for as a society as a whole, and not just what the political majority of the day is in favor of or against.
Again, just to say, if people have got a question, good time to come in. Very welcome to ask anything you'd like about these issues. And just as people think of what they want to ask, can I just ask about Angela Merkel? I mean, she left office with huge respect around Europe. There were many films made in the news programs all over Europe saying she'd been this major figure in European politics and, for such a long time in office. But increasingly, it looks like her legacy is down to that decision to allow so many people in.
I think that's very much an outside view, because it is most prominent, or it really sticks out to people who are looking at Germany from the outside. If people are asking what she's doing, she's about to publish a book in November, so everybody's waiting to hear her side of the story, not just of 2015. And a lot of people here in political Berlin are still unsure whether it's, whether they want to be mentioned or they don't want to be mentioned, what's worse or what's better. So yeah, she has this legacy. She's an overarching figure, but let me put it this way. You can talk a lot about how her 2015 legacy is unraveling, because that's what's happening right now. The sense of loss of control seems to be renewed right now. And there seems to have been a political backlash. Some people accuse her of being solely responsible for the rise of the far-right AfD party. I'm sure a lot of PhDs will be written on that as well. At the same time, was it a coincidence that Vladimir Putin waited until she was out of office and the new government took over to then launch a war of aggression on Ukraine? I don't believe that is a coincidence. I also think that speaks for her ability to keep Europe together and to really try and steer Europe, which is, a bag of fleas, really, in one direction. And she provided stability to Germany and to Europe. Whether that's outweighed by what we're seeing now, I think history will judge that. I don't think it's...
Yeah, it's a different perspective, is very well put. That probably is how outsiders see it and how people in Germany are viewing it. I want to throw this forward, and you mentioned Ukraine, but before we get onto that and what the policy implications are for Germany and all this shift to the right, we've got some elections coming up on Sunday, another state-level election. Tell us about that one.
Yeah, it's the state of Brandenburg, which basically surrounds Berlin. That's also a former East German state. The state premier Woidke, he is a very well-liked, established figure, a fixture, and his election posters read, if you want Woidke, you need to vote for the SPD, the Social Democrats. That's the party of the Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Instantly, the Social Democrat Party, which is now the biggest party in the government coalition, they were completely reduced to rubble pretty much in these other Eastern elections. So in this case, it's not the Conservatives, it's the Social Democrats who are neck and neck with the far-right AfD party. And look, the big shock here in the sense of an AfD win, that has now been kind of factored into how to shape the future. That's been absorbed already. But the shocker here could be that Olaf Scholz's party, even such a prominent figure, could be beaten by the AfD. And that could send shockwaves into his Social Democrats who are already struggling in the polls. They are nowhere near. They're like in the low double digits now. So they are really struggling to maintain their status of a Big Ten party and a party to be reckoned with. And this really could be, I don't want to say a nail in the coffin of the government, because I really don't think the government is going to break up. It's just going to spark yet more crisis, and it's going to spark a lot more infighting, and it's going to spark a lot more these three coalition parties, Olaf Scholz, the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the pro-business Free Democrats, trying to demonstrate unity while they're trying to create their own profile again ahead of general elections in a year's time. But that's an oxymoron. So it will lead to a lot more political energy loss to that infighting, but the government won't break up despite all the talk about it, because they have so much more to lose than to gain from breaking up. The pro-business Free Democrats, they would most likely not even make the 5% hurdle, as they didn't in those regional elections anymore, which means they would probably go from a party that shares in the government to a party that might not even, doesn't even have a safe ticket to be back in the Bundestag, in the German parliament. So they would be crazy to do it. The Greens also would lose a lot if they went to the polls right now, and the Social Democrats would be reduced to a small party, having come from being the party who represents the head of the current government. Although Olaf Scholz, when you speak to him, and I sit in backgrounders with him quite a bit, is confident that just like last time, where they looked like they had no chance of actually making it into the Chancellery and coming top, they might just make it once again.
Yeah.
None of the polls indicate that right now.
Right. Sarah Biffin has got a question. Sarah.
Go on.
Hi, Sarah. Can you hear us? I think you're unmuted, so it should be going well, but I actually have a written note of it, unless, Sarah, you can hear us. So she's just saying, how does the war in Ukraine affect the right-wing vote? And I was also interested in how the right-wing vote affects the war in Ukraine, actually. I mean, the other way around, and whether German support for Ukraine is weakening. So can you look at both sides of that?
Yeah. The war in Ukraine, and I mean, Germany is Ukraine's second largest supporter after the United States. It is now reduced in the new budget, quite significantly, how much money it wants to send in Ukraine's way. But the argument here is that that's not really a reduction, that is because there's an expectation that the G7 funding will come through. It's a loan that is based on money confiscated from Russia, and particularly the increase, what's called the, I can't think of the word right now, interest that is gained from that money. That's here, the far-right AfD party actually scored, and I'm glad you're raising that, greatly, because they are skeptical of German support for Ukraine. They basically say it's time for talks, and that diplomacy should have a bigger say in dealing with Russia, which frankly, I mean, I know I'm close to the people who deal with Russia, or with the whole situation, and these attempts have been there all along, but the feeling in the government is there's nothing to talk about. Having said that, doesn't really matter. On the election posters, you can literally see, vote for, do you want war or peace? And that's kind of the choice both the left party and the far-right AfD are giving people, and they feel like they're voting for peace if they're voting for parties who no longer want to arm Ukraine. So particularly in eastern states that are more, yes, they are more pro-Russian. There seems to be, or to put it in neutral terms, they want to find some kind of accommodation with Russia. And I would say that's also the government line, but the German government is not willing to just hand over Ukraine. And frankly, a lot of voters in the East who are voting for those parties, the AfD is quite happy to hand over huge chunks of Ukraine to Vladimir Putin, and so is the left, and so is the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. And that's really where the big difference is.
And Ukraine, I mean, Zelensky must be very worried about Germany then. Are you seeing efforts by the Ukrainians to make their case in Germany?
Yes. I mean, I'm about to head to a briefing, but the Ukrainian embassy has been always, and the ambassadors have always been very vocal in their call for more support from Germany. They are particularly disappointed that Germany is not providing longer-range weapons, the Taurus system, which is really state-of-the-art. But the counter-argument is that you could fly it into a formally specified window within the Kremlin, no problem. So that's a risk Germany is not willing to take, or particularly the German Chancellor, who single-handedly took that very decision. But at the same time, Volodymyr Zelensky always makes a point of saying he's grateful to Germany, and he has the pledge from the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, who keeps repeating that he will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. But what he's not saying, he's not quantifying, you know, it's not a kind of whatever it takes. It's more of a as long as it takes. And right now the situation is, we've seen the German Chancellor say time and time again that he wants to, that now is the time to work out what is possible in terms of a new peace conference. We've already seen one in Switzerland. And right now there are diplomatic efforts behind the scenes to also, together with Volodymyr Zelensky, let him develop what the basis could be for talks that include Russia this time. They excluded Russia last time around. Now Olaf Scholz is heading to the United Nations. It's the annual UN week. He's heading there this weekend. I'll be on the plane with him, traveling press, and he will, for sure, although that's not officially announced, but I'm pretty certain he will speak to Volodymyr Zelensky there, and US President Joe Biden will have a huge say in that as well. So I think we'll know a bit better what the next steps will be. Now, of course, the lingering issue still is whether particularly America will allow Ukraine to use weapons further into Russian territory to strike areas and military targets from where Russia is conducting attacks on Ukraine.
Yes, it's interesting to make that point that whatever Germany does in the end, it's going to be the United States election that probably determines a lot of this. But I was just wondering if you were privately asked if you're off for a Ukrainian briefing, I don't know whether it's the ambassador or someone briefing journalists there, and if that person quietly took you aside and said, "What's your assessment? You're a senior journalist here. You've got good insights into what's happening. Do you think Germany will be backing us in 3 or 4 years?" What would your honest advice be?
Yes, it will.
Right, because the center will hold.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would also want to point out is that even if the AfD and BSV get 40%, it's still, and they won't at the national level, nowhere near that. They'll probably get, the AfD will probably get 16, 17%. BSV might get 10%. They are the Ukraine skeptic ones. That still leads 3/4 of Germans who are not in favor of taking that line. Because everyone is always so alarmed. I don't want to talk it down. I mean, I think these are serious political forces to reckon with. At the same time, they are very far from a majority, and they are nowhere near. And I don't want to throw the BSV in the same basket with the AfD, just on that one policy issue where they have a similar take on reducing assistance to Ukraine. But that is something where Germany would also lose its claim to European and moral leadership here. So there is, so for sure, it's the word of the current chancellor, and if you look at the polling right now, we would expect, I think it just became more likely that Friedrich Merz could become the next chancellor of Germany, leader of the Conservative Party, after he was nominated as candidate this week, and there's also no sign that he would reduce or stop supporting Ukraine. What is also understood, though, and this is where all ends with who is in the White House, is a recognition that Germany, Europe cannot replace American help for Ukraine in any field. Just cannot match what would be lost if the US stopped supporting Ukraine. And that would be a completely different scenario.
I'm going to take one more last question, because I know you do need to go off to this briefing with the Ukrainians. I can see you looking anxiously at the clock. So let me just get Marty to come in. Can you hear us, Marty?
Yes, I can.
Great.
I want to go back to the immigration question. I'm in the U.S. And when I think about the immigrants, they are primarily Black and or Muslim. And I'm wondering, if they were white, what difference that might make in the thinking about immigration.
Michaela.
Yeah, I find that a very difficult one. I mean, what I would like to point out is that anti-migration sentiments are stronger in eastern states. That is true. And you can also see that's where very few migrants live. So the less people, and this is like just a sociology fact, the less people interact with people who come from different cultures, different backgrounds, who look different, the more xenophobic people are. So it's almost a self-perpetuating problem of, you know, not being able to, or not being exposed to someone who's somehow different from a different background. And I honestly cannot, I don't think it has the kind of racial sting as it does in the US, where I've just been there for a year. I fully understand how skin color makes such a huge difference. I mean, here it's anti-foreign can also mean you have a name that sounds different. You know, people don't necessarily see you, but if your name sounds Turkish or something, yeah, then you already have a harder time finding a job or finding a place to live. That's just like the individual experience that people are making. So yes, color of your skin plays a part, you know, is part of it, but I don't think I just really wouldn't be able to answer that question that simply. I know it's not satisfying, but it seems to be more anti-foreign. It doesn't have the kind of black and white, quite literally, sting it has in the United States, and I do understand why that is the case there.
Michaela, it's totally obvious why you're the chief political editor of Deutsche Welle. You're incredibly clear, and you explained it all so well. So we're very, very grateful to you. I know you've got to crack on and get to this Ukrainian briefing. You're a busy working journalist, so we understand that. And we're very grateful to you for helping us understand what's happening in Germany at the moment. Thank you very much indeed.